Alright, so the impact of industrialization on demographics. Overall, during this entire period of time, even though some people are getting really, really wealthy as robber barons, and other people are staying really poor, working in lousy conditions in the major cities, you do see an overall increase in the standard of living. Now, why does it happen? It happens largely here because since things are being mass-produced, then the cost of goods decreases and people can just afford to buy more stuff. Even though it may not be very good stuff, they can at least afford to buy more stuff. But you still going to see this huge increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. By 1890, the top 10% of people in this country basically controlled 90% of its wealth. So you see this huge gap in the rich and the poor. Now, the reason why we don't see a lot of social unrest like what happens in Europe during this period is largely because of the idea of the American dream. And it's the idea here, for example, Andrew Carnegie, who is a poor guy who comes over through his own wit and his own talent and his own intelligence and a lot of good luck. He's able to basically pull himself up by his bootstraps and become a lot wealthier. And this idea is going to be popularized by a writer during this period by the name of Horatio Alger. And Horatio Alger, he basically writes dime store novels where he glorifies the idea here of the self-made man. So these poor guys who come over, who work really hard, and are able to then become rich due to their honesty and their hard work and a lot of luck. And so examples of this, again, are Carnegie, but also Thomas Edison to a certain extent. Now, throughout this period, you also are going to see the rise in, for the first time, more of a white-collar workforce, in other words, the middle class. And the reason why is that as these businesses become larger and they have larger and larger unskilled poor workforce, there becomes more of a need for educated middle managers. And so by 1900, 2/3 of Americans are wage workers, but over 1/3 of Americans are going to be these educated managers. So education becomes a lot more important during this period. On average, the workers work 10-hour days, 6 days a week. And again, these low wages were justified by what Adam Smith called the iron law of wages. So in other words, wages were subject to supply and demand. So the more immigrants we have coming over who are competing for jobs, then the more demand there is for jobs and the less these companies have to pay their workers to get good workers throughout this period. And so as the supply of workers increases, let's see, where's my hand? Supply of workers increases, then their wages end up decreasing here throughout this period. And you also see a problem here in that real wages are going to be adjusted for inflation, but the wage of one worker is not going to be enough to end up supporting a family. And so in response to this, just about everybody in families, including children, ended up having to go to work, especially in urban areas in these factory jobs, just to be able to pay for their cost of living. By 1890, 11 million of the 12.5 million families that existed in this country only made $380 a year. So again, even though the standard of living is increasing, so is the cost of living along with it. And so by 1900, 1 in 5 women are going to be these wage workers. Now, in response to this, you're going to see that competing idea of the cult of domesticity that's still around from before the Civil War, where any women who didn't have to go to work stayed at home, and that was how they helped to prove their middle class status, was by wives not having to work. Only 5% of married women worked outside the home, so again, only the poorest of the poor had mothers who ended up working. And so this ends up really increasing that power of middle and upper class women in that cult of domesticity who didn't really have to go to work. You also are going to see, with these new inventions, an increase in the number of women who are going to have these clerical jobs. And so you're going to see the feminization of some occupations that previously had belonged to men. So, for example, here, a lot of jobs such as secretarial work are going to become the jobs of women here at the invention of the typewriter. You also are going to see telephone operators by the 1880s becoming largely women, but also teaching becoming a women's profession during this point in time. And as these jobs are becoming feminized, then they do end up losing status as their wages decrease. And so even here from the market revolution in the 1820s, when women ended up going to work, the concept was still that women only worked for pocket wages, not for a living wage to support their families. And so for that reason, a lot of jobs that women worked in then were seen as not really needing to support an entire family, and therefore those wages ended up decreasing.